December 29, 2006. London, a single keystroke closes an account that has been open longer than most people have been alive. $832 million leaves Britain and lands quietly in Washington. No ceremony, no headlines, just a receipt. What looks like a routine payment is actually the final breath of an empire, because this wasn't just a loan being repaid. It was the last installment on the price of survival. Here's the part you were never taught. Britain didn't lose its empire on battlefields. It lost it on balance sheets. Not 2 bombs, but 2 contracts. Not 2 enemies, but 2 allies. And the most shocking part, Britain won the war. In 1940, Britain owned a quarter of the planet. Its currency ran global trade. Its investments spanned continents, yet within a single decade, that same empire was functionally bankrupt, selling gold, selling companies, selling military bases, selling its future. All to one buyer, the United States. This video isn't about tanks or generals. It's about leverage, about how desperation creates deals that look generous on the surface and predatory underneath, about how a $3.75 billion loan quietly extracted hundreds of billions in real wealth over 60 years, and about how the mechanism used on Britain became a repeatable formula, because once you understand this story, something unsettling happens. You start recognizing the pattern everywhere. Currency crises, emergency loans, forced privatizations, fire sale assets. The same choreography replayed across decades, across continents, always ending the same way. But rewind, before the paperwork, before the signatures, before Britain was begging. In September 1939, Britain faced a threat no navy could block. It imported most of its food. Almost all raw materials: steel, oil, rubber, grain. War meant those lifelines could be cut. And Germany knew it. U-boats didn't need to conquer London. They just had to starve it. To survive, Britain needed one thing: American supplies. And America, officially neutral, had written the rules. Cash only. No credit, no mercy. That rule created the trap. Every shipment drained Britain's gold. Every purchase sold off another piece of the empire. And by the time Churchill realized the math didn't work anymore, Britain had already crossed the point of no return. What happened next didn't just reshape Britain. It quietly reshaped the world. And once that door closed, the empire never reopened it. Because behind the numbers was a design, intentional, repeatable, and waiting to be used again. On Britain first, then others. Across the 20th century, and beyond today. By late 1940, Britain was bleeding out in slow motion, not from bombs, but from invoices. Every crate unloaded from an American ship carried a hidden countdown. Gold was leaving faster than it could be replaced. Dollars were vanishing. Assets that had taken generations to build were being sold in days. Here's the terrifying truth. Britain didn't just spend its wealth, it liquidated it. Completely. In a move so desperate it still sounds unreal, Britain launched something called Operation Fish. Warships loaded with solid gold bars slipped across the Atlantic under heavy escort. $2 billion worth of physical gold-crossed submarine-infested waters. Not to fund victory, but simply to keep buying food and weapons for a few more months. This was the largest movement of physical wealth in human history. And it was gone almost as soon as it arrived. Then came the second sacrifice. British citizens were ordered to hand over their American stocks and bonds. Private wealth, seized by the state, dumped onto the New York Stock Exchange. $1 billion raised. Another lifeline burned. Still not enough. So Britain moved to the most damaging step of all. Selling income-producing assets. Railroads in Argentina, mines in South America, industrial holdings in the United States. These weren't luxuries. They were the very investments that paid Britain's bills every year. Selling them meant short-term survival at the cost of permanent weakness. It was like ripping out your lungs to keep your heart beating for another hour. By December 1940, the numbers became undeniable. Britain still needed billions in supplies already ordered. But there was nothing left to sell without destroying the post-war future entirely. Britain wasn't just running low. Britain was mathematically bankrupt. That's when Churchill wrote to Roosevelt. The letter wasn't dramatic. It didn't beg. It simply stated the reality. Britain could no longer pay cash. If America didn't change the rules, Britain would starve. And if Britain fell, Europe would fall next. Roosevelt understood the danger, but he faced a different enemy at home. Congress had banned loans to countries at war. The American public hated the idea of being dragged into another European conflict. Helping Britain openly looked like betrayal of neutrality. So Roosevelt needed something clever, something that sounded generous while protecting American interests, something that didn't look like charity. The answer was a story, a metaphor. A garden hose loaned to a neighbor whose house is on fire. That story became Lend-Lease. To the public it sounded humane. Tempera, friendly, but behind closed doors, the deal being drafted didn't look like a neighborly favor at all. It looked like a foreclosure agreement, and the man holding the clipboard wasn't a soldier. Was Treasury Secretary, and his instructions were brutal. Before America gave Britain a single dollar, Britain would have to prove it owned nothing left worth taking. The moment negotiations began, the tone changed. Britain wasn't treated like an ally fighting for survival. It was treated like a bankrupt corporation in receivership. And Henry Morgenthau, Jr., the U.S. Treasury Secretary, made that crystal clear. Morgenthau's position was simple and ruthless. If Britain still owned assets, then American taxpayers had no obligation to help. Before Lend-Lease could pass Congress, Britain had to open its books. Completely. Every gold bar, every factory, every foreign subsidiary, every dividend-paying company, whether owned by the government or private citizens. This wasn't diplomacy, it was an audit. British negotiators were stunned. No ally in modern history had ever been asked to inventory an entire empire under enemy fire. They warned that selling long-term assets during a war would force fire sale prices. They explained that these investments generated the income Britain would need to recover after victory. Morgenthau didn't care. If Britain wanted help, it had to strip itself bare. Then Morgenthau pointed to a single company as proof of concept. American Viscose Corporation, the largest rayon producer in the United States. It was owned by a British firm, and quietly sending millions in profits back to London every year. To Morgenthau, that income stream was unacceptable. "Sell it," he said. The British resisted. That company alone could fund imports for years. Morgenthau responded with an ultimatum. Sell American Viscose, or Lend-Lease dies in Congress. No vote, no food, no weapons. Britain folded. In March 1941, the British government seized the company and put it on the market. And because every banker knew Britain was desperate, the price collapsed. An asset worth well over $100 million sold for roughly half its value. The buyers were American investment banks. The proceeds went straight back to the U.S. Treasury to pay for weapons Britain had already ordered. This wasn't aid. It was forced liquidation with a smile. And it didn't stop there. While Lend-Lease negotiations crawled forward, Britain faced another emergency. German U-boats were sinking merchant ships faster than they could be replaced. Churchill needed destroyers immediately. The U.S. Navy had 50 old World War I destroyers sitting idle, obsolete, slow, barely useful to America. Roosevelt agreed to hand them over, but not as a gift. In exchange, the United States demanded 19-year leases on British military bases across the Atlantic, Newfoundland, Bermuda and Jamaica, Trinidad and Antigua, a chain of strategic outposts spanning the Western Hemisphere. Britain handed over global military positioning for half-functional ships. By the time Congress finally passed Lend-Lease, Britain had already surrendered gold, companies, and bases. Only then did the aid officially begin, and hidden inside the agreement was a single clause that would do more damage than any bomb Germany ever dropped. Article 7. And Britain barely noticed what it had just signed away. Article 7 didn't sound dangerous. In fact, it sounded fair. Diplomatic, almost boring. It stated that Britain would eliminate discriminatory practices in international trade after the war. To most people, that meant cooperation, free trade, a better world. In reality, Article 7 was a financial kill switch. Those discriminatory practices were the backbone of the British Empire. A system called Imperial Preference. It guaranteed that British goods were cheaper inside empire markets than foreign ones. Canada bought British steel. India bought British textiles. Australia bought British machinery. This wasn't ideology. It was survival. Imperial preference protected British industry from being crushed by America's far larger, more efficient corporations. By signing Article 7, Britain agreed to dismantle that system. British negotiators fought it. They warned that opening empire markets to American competition would destroy British exports overnight. They were right, but Churchill overruled them. The choice wasn't between prosperity and fairness. It was between signing or starving. So Britain signed. From 1941 to 1945, Lend-Lease kept Britain alive. $31 billion in aid flowed across the Atlantic. Food, fuel, weapons. Without it, Britain would have collapsed by 1942. But while Britain fought for survival, something quieter was happening in the background. American factories weren't just producing weapons. They were producing consumer goods for the world Britain used to dominate. American companies expanded into markets British firms had abandoned. While British industry was locked into wartime production, American corporations captured peacetime customers globally. By 1945, the transfer was already irreversible. Britain had sold $16 billion in overseas investments. Its gold reserves were nearly gone. Its trading system was scheduled for demolition, and American bases now ringed the Atlantic. Then the war ended, and 7 days later, the illusion ended with it. On August 15, 1945, Japan surrendered. Victory celebrations erupted across Britain. But behind the scenes, a telegram arrived from Washington. President Truman was terminating Lend-Lease. Immediately. No grace. Period. No transition. American ships carrying food to Britain were ordered to turn around mid. The aid stopped overnight. Britain's economy had been rewired for war. Factories made weapons, not consumer goods. Half the nation's food was imported. All of it paid for with American dollars that no longer existed. Within days, Britain faced mass starvation. The war was over, and Britain was more helpless than it had been at any point during the fighting. There was only one option left: beg for a loan. And the man sent to beg was Britain's greatest economist, already dying, already exhausted, walking into a negotiation he knew was designed for him to lose. John Maynard Keynes crossed the Atlantic knowing the numbers didn't lie. Britain had emptied itself to win the war. It had fought alone for 2 years, while America stayed neutral. It had sold its future to save the present. Keynes believed that mattered. He believed justice still had value. His plan was simple and morally airtight. Britain didn't need a loan. It deserved a grant. $6 billion, not as charity, but as payment for sacrifice. Britain had gone first. Britain had gone broke. Britain had bought time for the world. Washington didn't see it that way. By 1945, sympathy had an expiration date. American voters were tired of Europe. Congress didn't trust Britain's new Labour government or its socialist policies. The war was over, and with it, America's patience. So the offer came back colder than Keynes feared. Not a grant. A loan $3.75 billion. Barely enough to keep Britain fed. And it came with conditions so severe that Keynes called it Financial Munich. The most dangerous condition was hidden in plain sight. Sterling. Within 1 year, Britain had to make the pound freely convertible into dollars. During the war, Britain had created the sterling area, paying empire countries in pounds, but blocking conversion into dollars. That forced them to buy British goods. It was the last thing holding British exports together. Keynes knew what would happen next. The moment convertibility opened, every country holding pounds would rush to exchange them for dollars. American goods were cheaper, better, more plentiful. The pound would collapse. The loan would vanish. Keynes fought it. He begged. He warned. His health collapsed under the strain. But the choice was impossible. Refuse the loan and face starvation. Accept it and trigger a slow-motion collapse. Britain accepted. Parliament approved the loan in July 1946. Keynes died 3 months later, his heart failing under the weight of a battle he'd lost. On July 15, 1947, Britain did exactly what the loan demanded. It opened the pound to full convertibility. What happened next was instantaneous. India, Egypt, Australia, Argentina. Everyone rushed $4. In just 5 weeks, $700 million evaporated. Nearly 20% of the loan burned for nothing. Britain slammed the window shut after 35 days. The humiliation was total, and the consequences were immediate. Britain could no longer afford global commitments. In February 1947, it informed the United States it was withdrawing from Greece and Turkey. America stepped in. The Truman Doctrine was born. The handover of global leadership was complete. Britain had won the war, but it had lost the world. And the debt was only just beginning to work. The collapse didn't stop. It normalized. In 1949, Britain officially admitted what everyone already felt. The pound was devalued by 30% overnight. No warning, no bote. Every British citizen woke up poorer relative to the world. Savings shrank. Imports became more expensive. Living standards quietly fell behind America's for good. But the most brutal part of the story wasn't visible in daily life. It arrived once a year. Like clockwork, every year, the British Treasury wrote a check to the United States Treasury. Not for aid. For interest. The Anglo-American loan wasn't forgiven. It wasn't symbolic. It was commercial debt, with compound interest stretching across 6 decades. Through booms and recessions, through governments rising and falling, through empire dissolving and globalization accelerating, the payments never stopped. By the time the final check was written in 2006, Britain had paid back double the original loan. $3.75 billion became $7.5 billion, 60 years of tribute for surviving the war. But that visible debt was just the surface. Add up everything else. The gold shipped out. The overseas investments sold at fire sale prices. The annual income those assets would have generated for decades. The dismantling of Imperial Preference, costing Britain hundreds of billions in lost trade. The strategic bases, leased for 99 years, giving America permanent military reach. When you total it all, the wealth transfer isn't billions. It's hundreds of billions in today's money. Roughly $450 billion quietly extracted from the world's largest empire. And who benefited? Not the average American. The winners were specific. Investment banks that bought British assets cheap and collected fees on every forced sale. Corporations that filled the markets Britain abandoned while its factories were locked into wartime production. And the U.S. government, which emerged from the war with global bases, dollar dominance, and unmatched leverage. But the most important beneficiaries weren't individuals. They were architects, because while Britain was still fighting Germany, another meeting was happening behind closed doors. A meeting that would turn Britain's humiliation into a global system. A system designed to scale this process far beyond one ally. July 1944, Bretton Woods, New Hampshire. Britain arrived weakened, indebted, desperate. America arrived rich, untouched, dominant. And the rules of the post-war world were written accordingly. Keynes fought one last time. He proposed a neutral global currency, a system that wouldn't favor any single nation. America rejected it instantly. The dollar would rule, and the institutions enforcing that rule would be American-controlled. What Britain accepted at Bretton Woods wasn't recovery. It was a template. Bretton Woods didn't look like conquest. There were no troops, no ultimatums, just paperwork, signatures, and polite applause. But the structure it created was more powerful than any army. The dollar became the world's reserve currency. Global trade would settle in U.S. dollars, and 2 new institutions would enforce the rules: the International Monetary Fund and the World Bank, both headquartered in Washington, both weighted by voting systems that guaranteed American control. On paper, they existed to stabilize economies. In practice, they encoded the same logic used on Britain into international law. Keynes understood it immediately. The IMF wouldn't just lend money, it would attach conditions. Conditions that forced countries to open markets, sell state assets, remove trade protections, and make currencies freely convertible. Exactly the pressures that had destroyed Britain's economic independence. But Britain had no leverage left. It had legitimized the system, because rejecting it meant isolation, and so the empire that once ran global finance quietly signed away its influence over the future of finance itself. The irony was brutal. Germany, which lost the war, was rebuilt with Marshall Plan aid that didn't have to be repaid. Britain, which won the war, paid for 6 decades. The difference wasn't morality, it was bargaining power. From that moment on, the British experience stopped being unique. It became replicable. Crisis hits, currency collapses, capital flees. The IMF arrives with an emergency loan. The loan comes with conditions. State industries are privatized, trade barriers are removed, currencies are opened, domestic companies collapse under foreign competition. Assets are sold cheaply, debt remains. Mexico, Argentina, Brazil, Indonesia, Thailand, Greece. Over 80 countries have followed this path since 1946. Different flags, same script. This wasn't an accident. It was a system refined from Britain's collapse, optimized and exported. Britain helped design it, never realizing it was validating the very mechanism that had already stripped it of gold, markets, and sovereignty. By accepting Bretton Woods, Britain turned its own defeat into global policy. And the pattern didn't fade with time. It intensified. By the 21st century, debt wasn't an emergency tool anymore. It was permanent. Countries weren't escaping Italiano. They were revolving inside it, which brings us back to that quiet moment in 2006. A clerk closing a file. A final payment made what looked like an ending was actually proof the system worked, because Britain had paid. Fully, completely. And nothing had been returned. That final payment in 2006 didn't restore Britain's empire. It didn't reopen closed factories or reclaim lost markets. It didn't return the bases or the influence. It simply marked success from the lender's perspective. Because debt isn't about money. It's about control over time. For 60 years, Britain's policy space was narrowed by obligations signed under wartime duress. Budgets were written with Washington in mind. Currency policy was constrained. Ambitions were trimmed. The empire didn't collapse in flames. It dissolved under spreadsheets. And here's the unsettling part. Britain wasn't weak. It wasn't corrupt. It wasn't mismanaged. It did everything right. It fought fascism. It honored contracts. It paid every dollar owed. And still, the outcome was loss of sovereignty. That's why this story matters. Because when people hear about IMF loans today, they're told it's about responsibility, reform, tough medicine. But Britain proves something darker. Even discipline doesn't protect you once the mechanism is engaged. The same steps repeat. Forced asset sales justified as efficiency. Currency convertibility framed as modernization. Trade liberalization sold as progress. Each step looks reasonable in isolation. Together, they dismantle economic independence. Britain experienced it first because Britain was first to fall into the gap between empire and insolvency. America didn't need to conquer it. Britain walked itself into the deal because there was no alternative. And that's the genius of the system. It doesn't require malice, just leverage. Once debt replaces diplomacy, outcomes become automatic. Countries don't get invaded. They get restructured. They don't surrender flags. They surrender balance sheets. By 2025, global debt has reached levels that make Britain's crises look microscopic. Sovereign debt, corporate debt, household debt, all tied together, all denominated in dollars, all governed by institutions born at Bretton Woods. This isn't history repeating, it's history scaling. Britain lost an empire. Today, entire regions lose decades of growth, not because they lost wars, but because they lost negotiations conducted during moments of maximum weakness. And the scariest realization, once you see the pattern, you can't unsee it. Every crisis headline starts reading like a familiar script. Emergency meetings, loan packages, structural reforms, foreign buyers. Waiting. The British Empire wasn't the exception. It was the prototype. Here's the part most people never realize. This isn't just about history books or old treaties. It's alive today, running on autopilot. Think about countries facing IMF loans right now. The narrative sounds familiar. We must implement reforms to receive aid, open markets, privatize state assets, make currency convertible. Each clause echoes Article 7. Each loan mirrors the Anglo-American deal. The tools are identical. Forced asset sales, check. Currency crises, check. Trade liberalization, favoring outsiders, check. Domestic companies crushed while foreign corporations profit, check. And the beneficiaries are always the same kinds of actors. Powerful investment banks, multinational corporations, and governments positioned to project influence globally. History wasn't rewritten. History was codified. The British experience, painful, humiliating, seemingly isolated, was turned into a global blueprint. Now, consider the numbers. The Anglo-American loan stripped Britain of $450 billion in today's money over 60 years. Today, the global debt system extracts roughly $15 trillion every year. Planet-wide, and unlike Britain, most countries don't even know what they've signed themselves into. Britain's story teaches a lesson about leverage, timing, and opportunity. Victory in war doesn't guarantee security. Discipline doesn't guarantee independence. Wealth doesn't guarantee freedom, because control can exist without force. Influence can exist without armies. And debt can bind nations far more effectively than conquest ever could. By the time you connect the dots, the pattern becomes undeniable. The mechanism isn't secret. It's just disguised as aid, reform, or policy advice. It's in plain sight, operating silently, shaping economies, and reshaping global power structures. The British Empire paid for survival. The world is paying for compliance. And the rules are the same. They just scale differently. So, what does this mean for us today? The story of Britain between 1940 and 2006 isn't just history. It's a blueprint for understanding how global power works. When countries struggle, when economies collapse, when loans arrive with conditions, the mechanisms are often identical. Debt isn't about lending money. Debt is about control. Control over trade, control over resources, control over policy decisions, control over the future. And it started not with armies, but with contracts signed under duress, with policies disguised as aid, with small clauses that ripple into centuries of consequence. Every time you hear about structural adjustment programs, privatization requirements, or currency reforms imposed by international institutions, you're seeing the Anglo-American playbook in action. Same logic, same outcomes. Different countries, different decades. Britain paid for victory in war. Other nations pay for survival in peace. The pattern repeats. And the bigger the debt, the stronger the control. The richer the beneficiaries, the smaller the freedom of the debtor. History shows us that winning battles doesn't always mean winning the game. Sometimes survival itself comes at the price of sovereignty. And sometimes the greatest empires fall not because of enemies abroad but because of the deals they sign at home, under pressure, with no choice but to comply. The British Empire wasn't defeated by Hitler. It was stripped by contracts. It wasn't conquered by armies. It was conquered by leverage, finance, and strategy. And the mechanism it endured became the model for global economic control used on dozens of countries and still operating today. Understanding this isn't just about seeing the past. It's about recognizing the invisible systems that shape the world we live in. And once you see the mechanism, you can trace its influence everywhere from IMF loans to global debt crises to the hidden levers of power controlling modern nations. Because in the end, the real war wasn't fought with bullets or bombs. It was fought with balance sheets, contracts, and the quiet, relentless force of money.